She was tired of riding in her basket. She lounged on the doctor's knees and peered out the window. She seemed to know who Jinchi was, and sometimes she cuddled up against his ankles. Basin kept his distance from her. Perhaps he had never dealt with cats before. He did not seem to cope with many things very well. Those are for the summer rice season. They grow 2 crops each year here, rice and barley. Stick to wetland rice, and you can grow another crop in the same field without exhausting the soil, the quack added. Growing 2 crops in the same year meant taking that many more nutrients from the soil. However, the water for rice paddies actually restored nutrients in the ground, protecting against depletion. An ideal form of farming for such a water-rich area. As they moved beyond the fields, the forest came into view, and the village nestled nearby. There seems to be a wide range of natural resources around here, Maomao remarked. She thought there were so many resources that there didn't seem to be a compelling reason to focus on making paper, but other factors were at play. When we arrived here, the flatland already belonged to someone else, the quack explained. But they hadn't given the forest a second look. That forest had water from the nearby mountains running through it. It provided the resources for the village's paper industry. There wasn't enough to allow them to produce in bulk. However, they had been able to succeed by focusing on quality instead. Fortunately, the river was also a convenient way to transport their product. The 2 groups made different things, so the villagers got along well with the land's original inhabitants. When we arrived, the landowner was quite a fine fellow, the quack said. However, something bothered Maomao. As they passed by the fields, her eyes met those of a farmer stomping on the barley. This was a way of making the grain stronger, but the way he did it seemed almost angry. His look at her was sharp and dark. Maomao pretended she hadn't seen him and turned back to continue her conversation with the doctor. When they arrived at the village, a woman who looked to be around 40 greeted them. The softness of her eyes and the way they drooped reminded Maomao of the quack himself. She surmised the woman must be the quack's younger sister. The quack passed the cat to the woman. She smiled and stroked its fur. He must have told her beforehand that he would be bringing the animal. He evidently had not let her know that he would be travelling with an entire entourage. She looked at Maomao and the others with surprise. Elder brother, welcome home, she said. Yes, thank you, it is good to be back. The quack sounded calm enough, but tears beaded in the corners of his eyes. It was hard to blame him. He was seeing his home again for the first time in more than 10 years. I would like to visit the grave, he said. You know, father and they must have died while he was at the rear palace. He sniffed audibly. Yes, of course, but if you don't mind my asking, the woman glanced at Maomao and the others. Are these friends of yours? Maomao realized as the woman looked at them that she was seeing a housewife mentally calculating dinner preparations. So this is your superior from your workplace and your assistant. You could have said so sooner. So I am his assistant now. That wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly untrue either. The same could be said of the word superior, but as Basin elected not to say anything, he apparently meant to play along. Auntie Quack, she had told them her name, but it had been hard to catch, and Maomao frankly didn't remember it, so she simply resolved to think of the woman this way was busily loading the table with food. Steamed freshwater fish with herbs, baozi in a steamer basket, and golden sparkling fried rice all looked delicious. They looked perfect, in fact. She had to make them on short notice to account for the size of the party. There was also a concoction of fish and congee for the feline Maomao. He ate heartily, and without the dignity one normally associated with cats. She would certainly have grabbed the fish off the table if she thought she could get away with it. I must say, I never expected a eunuch like you to come home with such a lovely young bride. Ha ha ha, no such thing, I'm afraid, I suppose not. The teasing banter was accompanied by the sound of a bowl striking something hard. Maomao looked over and saw that Jinchi had dropped his tray. Goodness, no worries, I will get you a new tray right away, Auntie Quack said. She refused to ignore the man with the unsettling burn wound. In Maomao's opinion, if Jinchi was really going to play the part of a servant, he should have stayed with the carriage and eaten field rations. Basin likely hadn't approved of it. Jinchi's disguise was perfect, and Maomao hoped they wouldn't reveal themselves with a small mistake. By the time all the food was on the table, Auntie Quack's family had arrived. There were 2 younger men and a middle-aged man who wore a kerchief around his head. The middle-aged man was likely Auntie Quack's husband and the others were her sons, brother-in-law. It has been a long time, the husband said, removing his kerchief and greeting the Quack respectfully. Yes, it has been quite a long time, the Quack replied, smiling. One of the sons followed his father in greeting the doctor, but the other ignored the Quack entirely. Instead, he sat down and started eating with great enthusiasm. Stop that, how dare you not even say hello? Auntie said, glaring at the boy. Elder brother, the other son said, giving the young man an agonized look. So he was the younger one, and the man with the nasty attitude was the older brother. Quack nephew number 1 broke open a baozi and took a bite. The baozi was full of pork filling, and it made Maomao's mouth water. You say I should respect my uncle. He is a eunuch who has not been home in ages. What is he doing here now, and why is he dragging a whole crowd of visitors with him? At that, the Quack produced one of those eyebrow-drooping, uncomfortable smiles he seemed to specialize in. He was accustomed to being ridiculed for being a eunuch, but to suffer such mockery from his own nephew must have been painful. Even Maomao found herself put off by the boy's attitude. Was she going to stand by and let this guy speak disrespectfully and eat all the good food? She was not. She sat down firmly in her chair. If you don't mind, I'll get started before it goes cold, she said. Then she expertly snatched the exact piece of food her nephew had been going for. He shot her a nasty look, but she didn't care. She knew many menservants and soldiers who were bigger and burlier than this man. Basin looked as if he wanted to speak, but he seemed to calm down when he saw Maomao handle the situation. Jinchi maintained his composure. Auntie Quack was obviously angry. When she brought the congee and soup, she provided portions for everyone except her older son. Her husband and her younger son, clearly knowing what was best for them, did not comment. The older son, perhaps feeling upset at how his family was treating him, took another baozi and walked out of the room. When the boy was gone, Auntie Quack's husband scratched his head in embarrassment and bowed to the Quack doctor. I am very sorry, brother-in-law. He does not know how hard you have worked for this village, how much you have sacrificed. And in front of your superior, no less. Oh, it is quite all right. I am not bothered. I am used to things like this, the Quack replied, although he seemed quite conscious of Basin. Maomao poked Basin with a fingertip. He jumped slightly before saying, we are the ones who should apologize for showing up so suddenly. So he could at least be polite when the situation called for it. That was a relief. He was probably encouraged to mind himself by the relentless stare Jinchi was giving him. Good, then all is well, the Quack said, sipping some congee appreciatively. To him, the claim that he was used to things like this was an off-handed remark. But Auntie Quack was clearly troubled by it. He had become a eunuch to save her from being sold to the rear palace. Their parents likely valued a son more than a daughter. However, I know I did not come here only to have dinner. Isn't there something you would like to talk about? The Quack asked. The rest of the family became quiet. They had reached, it seemed, the real reason he had returned. As far as Maomao was concerned, she was simply part of the audience. She had no intention of stopping her eating. The steamed fish was perfectly salted, and the herbs came through beautifully. She would have to ask Auntie what she had done to it. Her husband set aside his chopsticks and looked at the Quack. Then, after a moment, he lowered his head. Brother-in-law, we hear you have become a renowned physician. You are so famous that you even delivered the Emperor's own child. You must have His Majesty's ear, and we beg you ask a personal favor of him. The Emperor's child was delivered by him, Maomao thought. In point of fact, her adoptive father Liumen had performed the delivery. But knowing the Quack, he might have embellished the story in one of his letters. Even Maomao, though, had enough decency to keep quiet at this moment. Basin frowned slightly. Jinchi seemed to be looking at something far away. The Quack, for his part, put down his chopsticks. His eyebrows drooped even further than usual. He said, to ask His Majesty to listen to me would be far beyond my station. Someone asked, even though you attended the delivery of the royal consort, it was impossible. Even the highest officials were not always allowed to speak with the Emperor. To seek a personal audience with him could be considered disrespectful and might cost the person their head. Maomao herself had been given the opportunity to speak to the Emperor on several occasions. However, each time it was because His Majesty had personally permitted it. Now Jyokai was no longer simply a consort. She was the empress. It would be difficult to reach her. At this rate, the quack looked likely to have the task forced upon him. If Basin decided to interrupt with some awkward remark, it wouldn't help the situation. So Maomao decided to take over the conversation. She said a previous physician of the rear palace involved himself in business that wasn't his responsibility. He was punished with mutilation and then banished from the palace. The others looked startled. Rumor has it he was foolish enough to learn something he didn't need to know. They say that's why he got in trouble. She was talking about her own father, true enough, but she wasn't really lying. She briefly wondered if it was safe to say as much as she had. However, there was no reaction from Basin or Jinchi, and she was glad she hadn't inspired any shenanigans from them. Auntie Quack and her family swallowed hard and looked at each other uneasily. Their shoulders slumped. The quack leaned forward, waving a hand. It is true I probably cannot speak to His Majesty, but there are other people I might be able to reach out to. Tell me what is on your mind. Auntie Quack and her husband shared a glance. Maomao wondered if she was imposing, but she had come this far. She wanted to hear the rest. Jinchi and Basin, evidently of the same mind, showed no sign of moving. Please speak, Basin urged. I can't promise how much help we might be able to offer, but we can at least hear you out. The words more properly belonged to Jinchi, but Basin was speaking for him at this time. The quack looked at them and nodded. Then he said, you can trust these people. It was a rare moment when he said the right thing at the right time. Well, if you say so, Auntie Quack said slowly, and then she began to speak. The problem has to do with land rights in the village. She said the land on which the village was built was actually rented. The owner had lived nearby and hadn't been using it, so he had been willing to rent it to them cheaply. But as the years went on, the two sides began to talk about selling the land outright. The landlord at the time was an easygoing man. He got along well with the villagers, according to Auntie. Some years ago, that man died. Then his son took over as landlord, and things began to change. The new landlord was different from his father. He disliked outsiders and often looked down on craftspeople. He was not pleased when the village received an imperial commission to supply paper to the court. He had come to the village several times demanding repayment of a debt when the quality of their paper had once dipped. The contract with the previous landlord stated the land and forest were lent to the villagers for 20 years. The amount of payment was clearly stated, and the village always paid on time. However, he kept insisting the rice harvest was down because we were polluting the water. He kept saying they did not have enough water to make rice, son number 2 said, and his face showed his pain. It has gotten even worse recently. He told us to pay immediately or to get off his land. There were 5 years remaining on the contract. The village found it difficult to gather 5 years' worth of money quickly. They needed to do it on short notice, but they were dealing with their landlord. Just as Maomao couldn't easily command the old madam, the village had to be careful in their dealings. If they had to leave, their houses and most of their belongings would have to stay behind. And who knows how long it might take us to find a new place to live. We think they simply want to drive us out of the village so that they can move in and start making paper themselves. Why in the world would they do that? They know how to make rice and we know how to make paper, so we should stick to our businesses, the quack said. His thin moustache waved gently. Maomao the cat, finished with her meal and with nothing to do, saw this and crouched, preparing to spring on the facial hair. You might think so, Auntie said, shaking her head. But the tax on grain suddenly increased this year, and the tax on our paper went down a couple of years ago. You can be sure that hasn't improved relations. Ah, so that is the reason. The reduced tax on paper was clearly intended to make paper more widely used and ultimately improve literacy. Regarding the increased rice tax, officials likely believed it wouldn't burden an area that harvested 2 crops each year. At the same time, the tax would strengthen reserves for the future. Maomao glanced at Jinchi. He appeared calm, but she noticed a little fidgeting. She thought this must be about dealing with insect damage to crops. Sending crops from areas with plenty to the hardest hit places would mean fewer people would starve. She knew Jinchi and the entire government were trying their best, and she didn't think they were wrong to do it. However, the people whose taxes were raised were understandably unhappy. They must have felt they needed to make up the difference in other ways. They did this by putting pressure on this village, for example. As the quack suggested, though, it wasn't as if one could simply move into the village and start making paper. There were certain things one had to know. Doing it right wasn't obvious without experience. The thing is, we have another problem to him, said the husband. He was evidently referring to the young man with the bad attitude. For certain reasons, he is more on the side of the farmers here. My brother, the younger brother, said. He smiled uncomfortably. How do I put this? He has been blinded. He sounded like he could barely say the words. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but the boy does not know much. He thinks all officials are the same, so that was why he had lashed out at the quack. He must have thought of eunuchs as indistinguishable from the bureaucrats who had raised the taxes. This is why we need your help. The request was to get them to lower the taxes. Not happening, Maomao thought. It was impossible, even though Jinchi was sitting right there. If an order given in the morning was rescinded in the afternoon, it would throw the country into chaos. It would have been one thing if these people had been on the edge of starvation. However, from what she could see, things did not seem that bad. This put the quack doctor in a very awkward position as well. There was truly nothing he could do to help. The cat sat on his knees, batting at his quavering moustache and leaving scratch marks on his chin. I'm afraid I'm just a eunuch, you see. The family's shoulders slumped at that. The husband rallied himself from his disappointment, though, and said, there is to be a conference tomorrow. Perhaps you could at least accompany us. Yes, that much I could do. He glanced at Maomao. She turned the look to Basin. Might I be able to attend as well? Basin asked. He pretended to be nonchalant, but he was hardly able to help being interested. He was, in his own way, directly involved in the matter. I'd like to be present as a third party, he explained. Well, the husband started, but he didn't say more than that. He was probably glad to have Basin with them, but he suspected the landlord would object. I will simply stand in the back and stay out of things. I will only speak up if the other party becomes too aggressive, Basin said. Then the husband nodded, still reluctant. And I will be there, of course, the quack said. Maomao thought that he would not be any help at all. She wondered if she might be allowed to be present. She took the other Maomao from the quack's knees just as the cat gave a fresh scratch. Auntie Quack's husband was the village headman. The family's house had enough space to put up visitors for the night. Maomao's group had planned to stay at a roadside inn, but they ended up staying where they were. Maomao was given a single small room. The quack was put in the master bedroom. Jinchi and Basin stayed in a large guest room. The bodyguards with them stayed in an annex. There were more than enough beds and sleeping mats. Day labourers would be hired when taxes were due, and plenty of furnishings were on hand. Auntie Quack offered to prepare the bath for them since they were guests. However, Basin declined, saying they had already put her to more than enough trouble. To be honest, Maomao would have liked to wash up. However, she could not contradict Basin, who was likely acting on quiet instructions from Jinchi. Instead, Maomao asked for a bucket to be brought to her room. She then wiped herself down with a hand towel. She wiped the sweat away. The water was too cold for anything more, but she decided to wash her hair. It was starting to get oily. She put hot water in the bucket for this purpose, just a cupful. She let down her hair. Then when it was good and wet, she added some soap. She rubbed her scalp gently and methodically, working out the grime. She rinsed away the suds and wrapped her sopping hair in a towel to dry. Her feet were cold, so she dipped them in the water. It was still warm. She was carefully wiping her hair when there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she said, but there was no response from outside. Puzzled, she opened the door a crack and looked out. She saw an unsettling man with a burn standing there. She did not say anything, she just opened the door, and the unsettling man, that is, Jinchi, came in. The window of her room was closed. She had been washing after all. The next room over belonged to Jinchi and Basin. The next room past that one was some distance away. She said, "You can talk. I don't think anyone is going to hear us." He asked, "Did I interrupt you washing?" His voice had its characteristic heavenliness. Evidently, he hadn't decided to try to alter it this time, which would explain why he had been staying silent. She replied, "Just my hair." "I am sorry for not being more presentable," Maomao said, continuing to pat her head as she moved the bucket to a corner of the room. It was a cramped space and the bed was about the only place to sit down. So Maomao remained standing looking at Jinchi. "You should sit down," he said. "My hair is still wet," she replied, giving him a look that she hoped meant, "Why are you here anyway?" Jinchi, touching the burn on his cheek, showed her a cloth-wrapped package. "I would like to get rid of this thing for a while." "Do you think you could replicate the makeup?" The package contained red dye, glue and a white powder. The glue used carefully crushed rice and it was quite tacky. On inspection she could see Jinchi's scar was starting to thin out. He sweated even when it was cold, and when he lay down to sleep the dye would start to rub off. "Probably." "I think I can do it," she said. She could use dyed glue to pucker the skin. Then she would layer the white powder on top of it to get more or less the right effect. Adding some shadows to make his face look sallow would complete the illusion. "If you would then."